Chairman, thank you very much. Chairman, the budget of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs largely concerns our contribution to various supranational institutions and activities. The most important, of course, being the EU, but also, for example, NATO. One could say that this is a policy-light budget. Dutch policy is not well reflected. We are a small cog in various ongoing international obligations, in which we make our voice heard. And what is that voice then? Actually, it is the voice of consensus. And that consensus has become increasingly clear in recent years. Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and especially the United States determine the direction. The Netherlands simply participates in that, and even takes the lead where possible. As far as we are concerned, the most important topic is the Ukraine conflict and the war with Russia. The usual context is provided in the explanation of the budget, the established narrative, and it is as follows. Russia is, as has been said, exactly 1,000 days ago today, suddenly and without clear reason invaded the sovereign state of Ukraine, has sown death and destruction there and conquered the eastern provinces of Ukraine. The Ukrainians have bravely held their ground against Great Russia so far, but it is challenging. With help from the West, Russia has been held back and suffered enormous losses. The strictest possible economic sanctions have been imposed on the country, while large-scale support has been provided in Ukraine. But despite all this, and despite enormous losses in personnel and equipment, the Russians now seem to be making progress, and we must prevent that at all costs. The belief is that the dangerous dictator Putin, with his aggressive expansion, will not stop at Ukraine. He wants to restore the Soviet Union and even the entire Warsaw Pact. That is why it is also our war. Putin must not win this. Chairman, the situation outline I just provided may be somewhat brief, but in my opinion it does reflect the essence of the version of events that the average Dutch person, the average Western citizen, is presented with daily regarding the Ukraine conflict. I have had great difficulty with that narrative from the very beginning, first and foremost from the ordinary Dutch interest. Russia is by far the largest country in the world with a huge nuclear arsenal, reportedly even larger than that of the United States. Ukraine was at that time a part of the Soviet Union, of Russia in the Commonwealth. When two countries have a dispute, it is initially not our business. Neither country is a member of NATO. We have no special ties with Ukraine. A kind of family feud, therefore, within a family that is not ours. We could at most play the role of their sisters with peace on our continent as the goal. But to fully take sides with Ukraine and challenge the largest nuclear power on Earth seemed to me a particularly bad idea at the outset. To immediately shout that this is also our war seemed irresponsible to me right away. After all, we are here for the Netherlands. Our country is indeed endangered in that way. Where has diplomacy gone? But when you delve into the backgrounds and causes of the Ukraine conflict, it gets even crazier. Then it turns out that the situation outline presented to us is a complete distortion of reality. Then it turns out that the eastern provinces of Ukraine, where largely ethnic Russians live, were systematically oppressed. And after the Maidan coup in 2014, with Western assistance from West Ukraine, they were bombarded, resulting in many thousands of civilian casualties. And that Russia has sought attention for this in every conceivable way, and has even concluded treaties with Ukraine, France, and Germany through the UN. These were violated and later laughed off by Merkel and Hollande as a delaying tactic to give Ukraine the opportunity to arm itself against Russia. Deception. Fabricated by the West, the violation of treaties and agreements has proven to be a continuously recurring pattern since the early 1990s. In that light, there is absolutely no question of invading a sovereign state without cause, an unprovoked attack. There was indeed a concrete and urgent reason. Tens of thousands of people were. With shelling, the break is revealed. Moreover, the concept of sovereign states also deserves some nuance. Prior to the Maidan coup, the United States invested billions in building democracy in Ukraine. This was proudly reported at the time by John McCain and Victoria Nuland. In fact, Ukraine was already being prepared at that time as a Western battering ram against Russia. The country was turned into a heavily armed fortress. There are 12 fully equipped CIA espionage posts, forward operating bases, set up at the Russian border. The country was certainly fully controlled by the US after 2014. The appointment and dismissal of key figures in the judiciary was also directly influenced by the United States, as evidenced by the forced dismissal of the prosecutor in the Burisma case. Nowadays, I couldn't survive a day without Western financial aid. With a sovereign state, I have different associations, Chairman. The image that arises is one of years of trying to weaken Russia through intimidation, deceit, and trickery, driving a wedge between the EU countries and Russia, and largely exploiting Ukraine for this geopolitical goal. The blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline also fits into that picture. Initially, that action was blamed on Russia, but that absurdity is not believed by anyone. Recently, in an unguarded moment, Ms. Kaja Kallas, the new EU Foreign Affairs representative, suggested that Russia should actually be divided into a large number of separate countries. Regime change, with a scenario of balkanization. Is that not actually the underlying goal of the West, to then exploit the natural resources? Is it not completely understandable that Russia has serious problems with this? It is astonishing, Chairman, that there is not a single attempt in the mainstream media to seriously understand Russia's intentions in this war. For decades, actually since my earliest youth, the adage has been that if it were up to the Russians, they would prefer to occupy the entire continent up to the North Sea. Russian in the kitchen, the halbe Zijlstra perspective. This Russophobia is unfounded and incomprehensible, especially after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. It is notable here that the Western media and the well-known think tanks function entirely as mouthpieces for NATO, which seems to directly source its information from the Ukrainian services. For independent analyses, we are reliant on social media and podcasts from free thinkers who have their own sources on the ground and who live off subscriptions and donations with large viewership. Well-known names here include Jeffrey Sachs, John Mearsheimer, Douglas McGregor, Jacques Bout, the Duran, Scott Ritter, Brian Belichick, Gilbert Doctoroff, the Military Channel, and many more. What the Russians themselves have indicated as the goal of the military operation is clear and also not entirely incomprehensible. They want to protect the Russian population, which of course also includes Ukraine. They do not want an aggressive NATO state at their border. Ukraine must be neutral and disarmed. 2022, a draft agreement was made with Ukraine to this end. At that time, there was no question of Russian conquests at all. However, this agreement was strongly discouraged by Boris Johnson on behalf of NATO, and he convinced Zelensky to continue fighting. At that moment, this entire war could still have been prevented. Then the war itself, the progress on the battlefield. Here too, in my opinion, we are being presented with it completely incorrectly. The Russians would have enormous shortages of ammunition. Soldiers would massively desert. They would only have access to antique weapon systems with chips from washing machines. And NATO is superior in all areas. The new Leopard tank would make the difference. The Bradley was groundbreaking. The Javelins were effective against Russian tanks. The Russians had never heard of drones. And the HIMARS, Patriots, and F-16 systems, the Atacams, Scalps, and Storm Shadows were unbeatable. None of that has been proven. In terms of ammunition and war equipment production, Russia seems to far surpass the entire West. There seems to be no shortage at all. However, on the Western side, the Russians would suffer gigantic losses, while the situation on the Ukrainian side is not as bad. Those stories also turn out to be false. The losses on the Russian side are carefully recorded by Mediazona, an anti-Russian organization that investigates this in various ways, through official sources, but also through raw messages on social media and such. And they arrive at a total loss of 78,000 men on the Russian side. The losses on the Ukrainian side are not mentioned anywhere, but are estimated by various independent experts to be at least 5 times that number. It is a war of attrition, aimed at disarming and neutralizing the opponent, and that seems to be going quite well. It even appears that Russia has largely disarmed the entire NATO. It is certain that Ukraine and thus NATO will lose this struggle. It was easy to predict beforehand. So far, the Ukrainians have not been allowed by the United States to carry out attacks on uncontested Russian territory using Western long-range precision weapons, the ATACMS, storm shadows, and shells. Because these weapons, due to their complexity and dependence on Western satellite systems for targeting and guidance, essentially need to be operated by Western specialists, such an attack is perceived by the Russians as a direct attack on their territory by the West, as a direct act of war, therefore. This restriction by the United States seems to have been lifted last weekend to the joy of many parties in the West. Now Ukraine is free to really fight, that is the idea. It apparently has done so immediately, as reports today indicate a Ukrainian rocket attack on the Russian region of Bryansk. The use of these precise rockets for attacks on Russian territory is a cynical move by the current American President Biden to poison the starting position for the new President Trump through a new escalation. Extremely risky. Moreover, this does not change the military outcome of the conflict. Just now, Trump seems to be opting for escalation and will likely just withdraw in the end, leaving it further to the Europeans. America will probably focus its foreign policy on Taiwan and the Middle East. And Europe is left with the aftermath, a devastated and heavily traumatized country, hundreds of thousands of victims. And we must wait to see which parts Russia will allow to exist independently and under what conditions. A thoroughly and sustainably damaged relationship with Russia, all of this could have easily been prevented. Chairman, it is the task of the Minister of Foreign Affairs to prioritize the Dutch interest on the geopolitical chessboard regarding democracy. For some here in this chamber, that means strengthening defense and establishing a European army to withstand the threats from Russia and possibly also China. In our view, that is completely out of touch with reality and dangerous. For us, prioritizing the Dutch interest means steering towards de-escalation, alleviating the situation, and attempting to restore relations with Russia, reflecting on our own long-term foreign policy instead of simply following the international consensus. Should we continue uncritically on the Atlantic course, perhaps participating in the next rounds of sanctions against China, potential next victim of American assertiveness, or the more unconventional course followed by Hungary and Slovakia, perhaps closer contacts with Turkey, or even applying for BRICS membership, a bit too wild perhaps at this stage. In the short term, it seems wisest for the Netherlands to first focus on Germany, where Chancellor Scholz had a phone call with President Putin last week after more than 2 years of radio silence. Scholz still indeed opposes the deployment of cruise missiles and wants to push for de-escalation. 68% of Germans agree with him, a differing voice within the once so united NATO that the Netherlands should promote. Chairman, simply going along with the Atlantic consensus has brought us nothing but misery. We need to start thinking for ourselves again. The arrival of President Trump and his team with new ideas can help with that. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs take the lead in this new thinking. Thank you. For the people at home, don't forget to like, subscribe to our channel, and click here for the next video.